Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Andy Norman, who is the author of Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind-Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think. His research illuminates the evolutionary origins of human reasoning, the norms that make dialogue fruitful, and the workings of the mind's immune system. He champions the emerging science of mental immunity as the antidote to disinformation, propaganda, hate, and division. He is also founder of CIRCE, the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative. Andy Norman, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks very much, John. It's nice to be here. I appreciate the invitation to join you on the show.
We had a short conversation before we got rolling here, Andy, and I would love for you to start this off to talk about your center that you founded. The initials spell out CIRCE, and there's a connection with Greek mythology. Could you start there, please?
There is, sure. So I'll start with the ancient Greek myth. So Odysseus was a Greek explorer who was preparing to sail past an island inhabited by seductive sirens. And these sirens had a long history of luring unsuspecting sailors to their doom because they'd be entranced by the siren's song and dash themselves on the rocks in an attempt to get closer to the sirens. But before he sailed his ship past this dangerous island, Odysseus consulted with a Greek goddess named Circe, and she advised him on how he could safely navigate past the island. So Circe advised him to have his sailors plug their ears with wax so that they couldn't hear the song, and Odysseus himself opted to be lashed to the mast of his ship so he could hear the song, but be unable to hurl himself overboard to try to get closer to the sirens. So he was the first person, according to the mythology, who heard first man to hear the seductive song of the sirens and live to tell about it. So this is something of a metaphor, I think, for us, insofar as there's lots of seductive information out there that can harm us. And there are bad actors out there who are actually propagating dangerously disorienting information related to our health, information related to political parties, information related to political ideologies. And if people like this can get away with their attempts to essentially seduce us with their disinformation, we become manipulable by them. So turns out there's a new science called cognitive immunology, which builds on 50 or 60 years of research to show that the mind has an immune system just as the body does. But where the body's immune system protects us from infectious microbes, the mind's immune system protects us from infectious ideas. So it turns out we all have mental filters for filtering out bad information, but they don't always work very well. And we need to figure out how those filtering systems work and how we can make them work better, which is another way of saying we need to take critical thinking to the next level and teach it widely. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that the key to doing that is to learn from the science of how the mind filters out bad ideas and how it makes mistakes and how we can strengthen those systems.
Yeah, thanks for that. You are the first philosopher to be on the podcast, a bona fide philosopher. But actually, this is the second and relatively recent reference to the Odyssey that we've had on the podcast. I recommend to listeners go back and listen to an episode that we had with Dr. Mike Vickers from a month or so ago when this podcast with Andy drops, where we referenced the blinding of the Cyclops in the Odyssey and how that also relates to national security in this moment that we are experiencing today. So thanks for that recap about CIRCE. So you Andy, have been studying this problem since long before it's been on the front pages of the
Yeah.
news here in recent years. Could you give a quick recap of some of the foundational work in this field and bring us to date?
Yeah. So, long before we became concerned with toxic ideologies dividing America, long before Russian disinformation and social media came along to put stresses on our democracy that we didn't foresee, philosophers have been studying the problem of how minds take up bad ideas and are affected thereby. So there's the word philosophy actually means the love of wisdom. And what philosophers do is try to figure out how we can become a little bit wiser. And it turns out that if you can weed out bad ideas, the wise are characteristically good at weeding out bad ideas, whereas the clever are characteristically good at generating clever new ideas.
Oh.
So it turns out philosophers have been sort of studying how we can spot and remove bad ideas for a long, long time. What's new is that we can now use the concepts and the tools of immunology to express these insights with scientific precision and actually develop interventions that will allow us to think more critically and more capably in a very confusing information environment.
Yeah, so we're recording this on the 20th of September, 2021. And so we are a full year and a half or more into the COVID pandemic. And so the concept of immunology and inoculation have a very current interpretation for today's world. But inoculation is an interesting way of thinking about how to prevent bad ideas from taking hold in the first place. But there's also the opposite side of the same coin, in that bad ideas, once they do get rooted, then they are especially hard to unroot. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the whole idea that we might inoculate minds strikes many people as kind of new and unusual, but the research, psychologists began studying how you can inoculate minds against information back in the 1950s. And they discovered something fascinating, which is that if you expose a mind to a weakened or slapdash version of an important argument, and then show how that argument is silly or wrong or not worth your time, your audience will actually develop resistance to the better version of the same argument, to the good version of the same argument. So the psychologist who discovered this, his name was William McGuire, saw the analogy with inoculation. So when you inoculate somebody's body, you expose them to a weakened form of a virus. The body develops antibodies and thereby becomes resistant to even stronger versions of the same virus. Turns out the mind behaves in a very similar way. You can expose a mind to a weakened form of an argument, say by straw manning the argument, presenting a silly version of it, dismissing it, and then your audience will become resistant even to good versions of the same argument. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And your colleague, actually, Andy, Kathleen Carley, there at Carnegie Mellon, she describes this in a discussion that I had with her as well. See, this is what I recall her saying, and tell me, please, Andy, if this fits with what you were just describing. But she was describing on, say, Twitter, on social media, the falsehood could potentially start out as follows. Like, I hear somebody saying something about the vaccine doesn't really work. It's just, kind of like a real wispy, not there's no references or anything, but it's just kind of like I hear people talking about this, and it just kind of
Yes.
starts that way, and then it latches into people's brains, and then
Yeah.
it builds from there. Is that about right? Maybe.
Yeah, that sounds exactly right to me. So there are people who study the way memes spread across the internet and the way disinformation spreads across the internet. And a lot of times it starts off with a rumor or just a conjecture, or I heard someone. I mean, Donald Trump was a master at this, right? People tell me that this, and it goes out there,
Mm-hmm.
and then other people who hear that often just lop off the qualifying introduction that says, yeah, this might not be real, but, and they just hang on to the substance of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it starts to spread as if it were a fact.
I see.
So the cognitive defects there that allow the disinformation to propagate that way are very like like a suppressed immune system. So in the same way that an immune system can be underactive and not do enough to fight off dangerous microbes, the mind can become underactive and not do enough to fight off bad information.
Mm-hmm. Is there a similar phenomenon with truthful information, or does truthful information not have the same dynamic of entering an ecosystem and polluting it with truth, and truth blossoms spontaneously? Or, I mean, what's
truth can spread, and the question then becomes: is that viral like, or is that? I think it's misleading to characterize the spread of a truth as a mind. So in the book, I actually do say the bad ideas and falsehoods are actually mind parasites.
Mm-hmm.
They will parasitize minds. Minds become the hosts, and then they can actually do harm to their hosts the same way the parasites do. But when a good idea or a truth spreads, though, it tends to benefit the host. So I think we should think of those as mind symbionts, right? Because we have a symbiotic relationship to truths and good ideas, and we have a parasitic relationship to bad ideas and falsehoods.
Right. You go on to talk about misinformed belief, and how once a mind parasite has latched on, it becomes especially difficult to unlatch it.
Yeah, I like to say that it's a lot easier to prevent a mind infection than to cure one. And one way to kind of make that vivid to yourself is it's far easier to teach a kid how not to fall into a cult than it is to deprogram a kid that's already become part of a cult. Right? It can take years to help somebody who's fallen under the sway of a cult leader. But some simple lessons from a parent when a kid is young can prepare that kids so that they never fall under the influence of that cult leader. And very similar interventions, I think, can save us from falling prey to morally disorienting political or religious ideologies. So I think we need to learn how to raise our kids so that their minds are more resistant to damaging information.
In your book and in your research, you also talk about overreactive and underreactive cognitive immune systems. Could you help talk about the difference there? That might not be obvious to people.
Yeah. So let me give an example. So back in May of 2020, Donald Trump gave a press conference where he suggested that if we could just get people to ingest disinfectant, maybe that would help us combat COVID. Now, people reacted to that in very different ways. many people who know about the chemical properties of disinfectants responded with astonishment and disdain for this proposal. And in fact, Donald Trump's coronavirus task force coordinator, Deborah Birx, was standing next to him, or seated next to him in the White House briefing room. And when he looked at her for approval, she looked mortified and had like, what do I say? What do I say to that? Mm-hmm. But it turns out that there are Americans out there who trust Trump's suggestions so completely that they went out there and tried to figure out it and began to figure out ways to get in disinfectant into the bodies of their children. So, for example, one woman called up a local doctor and said, I want to disinfect my kid, but I'm not sure if I should make her drink the bleach or if I should inject it. Can you help me? Mm-hmm. Now, this woman, her mind is clearly was not prepared to fight off and what many of us would consider a blatantly bad idea. Mm-hmm. I would call that an example of an underactive mental immune system, one that was unable to raise the relevant questions or doubts. So doubts, it turns out, are the antibodies of the mind. And this woman had too few of them. And she came very close to poisoning her child.
Right. And could you just connect that up with a medicinal example? What would be a medicinal example of an underreactive immune system?
Like to a biological or physical?
Yeah, is it like I mean, like lupus? Isn't lupus something where if someone has lupus, they're especially susceptible to just about any, or AIDS? AIDS would be an underreactive immune
AIDS
system.
is the one I know about. I do know lupus is an immune disorder, and AIDS, it's right there in the name, acquired immune deficiency.
Right. Okay.
Syndrome.
All right. So
Right.
A underreactive immune system would be like AIDS in that you are highly susceptible to bad stuff coming into your ecosystem.
Because your body doesn't generate the right antibodies.
I see.
And I think our minds can fail to react by generating the appropriate doubts to bad ideas also. So that would be an example of cognitive immune deficiency.
Gotcha.
Right?
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah.
But then I owe you an answer to the other side of the question. What happens when a mental immune system gets overactive, right? So we know, I'll start with the body, the case of the body, right? There are now dozens and dozens of diseases that biologists classify as autoimmune disorders. And the autoimmune disorder means that the immune system is so hyperactive that it attacks the body itself. So the immune system sends antibodies coursing through your blood and through your body, and it's supposed to attack invaders but leave the body alone. But it can get confused about which is which, and it can fail to attack genuinely dangerous invaders. That would be deficiency, or it can actually attack the good stuff, nutrients or the body's own tissues, and that's called autoimmunity. Okay, right. So I'll tell a joke to illustrate what cognitive autoimmunity looks like. Okay. So Fred the flat earther dies and goes to heaven. And he marches into God's inner sanctum and says, hey, God, I've been a flat earther my entire life. So I really want to know, is the world flat or is it round? And God looks at him and he said, Fred, I'm sorry to say, but the world is very round. And Fred goes, this conspiracy goes higher than I thought.
Okay. Yeah. Even when God tells them not good enough. Yeah.
Right. In other words, your mind can generate doubts where there shouldn't be any. Now, I don't mean to say that we shouldn't have doubts about God's existence, but in the context of the story, I think what makes the joke funny is that Fred had doubts where presumably he shouldn't have had any. I mean, so if you're actually facing God and he's talking to you, presumably he exists, and in which case, doubting him would be a little bit crazy. Yeah. And there's a good deal of overactive doubting in the thinking of flat earthers. So a friend of mine is a philosopher of science. He would undercover at a flat earth convention. And he discovered that a lot of the leading flat earthers aren't these kind of gullible yokels you might think. Some of them are amazingly sophisticated. The problem is that their minds just generate these ridiculously absurd doubts, and then press them so aggressively that their thinking comes unhinged.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And conspiracy thinking generally has this quality, right?
Right, right. Yeah, it's like has the effect of really rocking their world, or they shut down and don't listen.
Right. So a proven technique, a technique that cult leaders use is to win the person's trust and then convince them that nobody else is trustworthy, that their parents and their friends and their employers, or all of them, are part of a part of the problem. So effective cult leaders actually manage to sever a person's trust with almost everybody else so that they become hugely dependent on the cult leader themselves. But in the process of doing that, they need to generate, over the top doubts about many things that are objectively reliable.
Right, right. We had another episode with a gentleman named Dr. Chris Paul, and he's the fellow that coined the term the fire hood of falsehood. You've maybe heard that term before, but
Fire hose of falsehood?
that is correct. The fire hose of falsehood. Yeah, thank you. Very good, Andy.
Okay.
Yeah, the fire hose of falsehood. So I want to ask you something that he mentioned and see how this fits into all of the
Sure.
mental immunity. So
Yeah.
he talks about how frequently, not always, but frequently, lies or misinformation, there's like a little kernel of truth, nestled in there somewhere, but it's either, somehow that little kernel of truth gets warped. And so, back to your example with Trump just a few minutes ago, and I don't want to take anything away from the example that you were calling out there, but when he was talking about that, bleach in the body, or using light to help fry away the virus and all this different stuff, I believe that he was actually briefed on some legitimate scientific techniques which were looking at doing that very kind of a thing. And in a very ham-fisted way, he talked about it during a press conference, and it all came off as being very silly. And the way he presented it was silly, but there was, like, back to my point with the fire hood of falsehood, there was like a little kernel of truth in there that got distorted. Anyway, do you think you could? What's your comment on all that?
So that's an element of the scenario I had not heard of before, but seems to me quite likely to be true. So I'm happy to accept it. Yeah. I should say that. So one of the things that's really important to do to de-escalate culture wars is to listen sympathetically to people you disagree with. In fact, that helps to keep your mind from overreacting or reacting defensively to information it perceives as a threat. So most of the people I hang out with are progressive. And when they heard the news of this press conference by Donald Trump, they went straight into disdain mode. What a ridiculous, childish, superficial, ignorant answer. So all of the memes that spread through progressive networks on social media were very disdainful of Donald Trump's suggestion. But if I actually put my fair-mindedness hat on, and I try to do this from time to time, a couple things. Number one is, when you look at the footage from that press conference, Donald Trump was very explicitly offering it as just a suggestion worth looking into. He was floating a hypothesis. And floating a hypothesis is something every scientifically minded person should respect as part of the scientific process. And as you say, there may be other details where, in fact, certain forms of disinfectant might have actually had some real promise.
Right.
So I think in all fairness, we should grant those points. And also, and I think fairness from conservatives would have to acknowledge that Trump's floating of this idea actually led to many people harming their children.
Yeah. No doubt. I think maybe the point I was trying to make, that press conference with President Trump was perhaps not the best example, but you brought it into the right discussion space. Is that, sometimes misinformation or disinformation contains a little kernel of truth, and that helps with the stickiness of embedding like a bad idea or a mind parasite.
Yes, I think that's right. And I mean, think about. I think. Take the. Was it the Area 51 UFO mythology that evolved online? I mean, I think there was actually a weather balloon or something that fell in that. I don't know the details of this case, but
sure,
there was an actual.
Yeah, once upon a time, there was probably something that really happened in the desert in New Mexico, which was curious, and there you go. That you're off to the races.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's probably a better example. Thank you, Andy. Something can I try something out on you here and just get your reaction to it? So I think of the way individuals navigate the world is it's like our brains are constantly simulating our environment.
Good.
And we're doing so in order to continually test hypotheses of reality. So when I reach for my cup of coffee, as I'm doing right now, I have an expectation that my fingers are going to grasp the handle and that it's going to come to my lips. It's going to have a certain sensation. And in a way, that helps me pursue my individual goals of taking a sip of coffee, but it also confirms my lived experience. Like, oh, okay, it happened again like I expected. That reinforces my beliefs about reality. And so it's like we are like living Bayesian machines that are constantly intaking new information and using that to update our belief systems.
You summarized a lot of cutting edge cognitive science there with beautiful simplicity. Yeah. So the prevailing consensus, or the emerging consensus, if you will, among cognitive scientists, is that our brains are largely sort of prediction engines that are constantly shaping models of reality that allow us to set reasonable expectations about the future. Because if you don't know how the world is going to react to your behaviors, it's hard to behave in adaptive ways. So the way the forebrain of the human animal is supposed to work is that it lets us generate extremely sophisticated simulations of how the future might unfold if you reach out for a coffee cup, for example. But those simulations depend on a kind of a working model of how the world works. And everything's fine as long as your expectations are borne out. So you reach out, the coffee cup's right where it says it is, and it behaves the way you expect it to. That reinforces, according to the rules of Bayesian updating. Bayesian just means a mathematical approach to modifying your estimation of the likelihoods of things. So Bayesians tell us how we can mathematically update our beliefs so that our models become progressively more adaptive. Right. Now the problem comes in when you form an expectation based on your models and it's not borne out.
Right.
So suppose you buy into a political ideology because it feels right, And then that political ideology has you at, let me change my example here. Scientists will often develop a theory, which represents a model of reality, and they'll start testing it, sometimes expecting the model to be confirmed, but find that the data clashes with it. And then the problem becomes, well, what do we do now? Do you toss out the data, do another test, or do you revise the theory? And it turns out that when it comes to our beliefs about ethics, politics, and theology, we grow very emotionally attached to our mental models and highly resistant to updating them. And when information comes along that says, hey, time to update your model of how political liberalism works, or what political conservatism stands for, we dig in our heels and say, no, I'm not going to change that because that's central to my identity. Right.
That the whole identity, that's its own big, huge area of philosophy, I think, right?
It is, and it's also affecting a big new branch of psychology too, where we're studying how people form a sense of who they are, and how their identity sort of shapes their behavior in various ways. Right. And I think one of the findings that I talk about in my book is that it's very easy to hitch your identity to problematic ideas and then treat any information that challenges those ideas as threats. And your mind's immune system interprets that data as a threat and tries to neutralize it, even though it's that data is actually trying to educate you and update your mental models.
And in your book, I believe you talk about this as a meta belief, and how this is an important concept in updating the way you perceive the world.
Yeah, so there's a Canadian research team led by a guy named Gordon Pennycook that has found that if you have the meta belief that beliefs should change in response to evidence, in other words, if you bring an open-mindedness to your experience of the world and continually try to learn, then you're relatively resistant to conspiracy thinking, propaganda, science denial, and those things. But as soon as you begin to compromise that meta belief, as soon as you begin to set that meta belief aside and saying, you know what, I don't have to change my mind because I don't want to. And it just feels better for me to believe this because it puts me in good standing with my social circle. The moment you start doing that, your mind's immune system starts getting compromised. Your ability to sift out falsehoods from truths begins to go haywire.
Right.
So the takeaway there is that all wishful or willful believing weakens the mind's immune system. You should never believe factual things because you want them to be true. Only believe them because you have sufficient evidence.
Could I ask a question about a little bit more of a national security related question?
Please.
Fundamentally, information operations or information warfare is about using information as a weapon to influence decision making, and it could be influencing the decision making of a single person or a single player in a system or an entire society, or even influencing machines. But how would you bring your work on cognition and how people think into that kind of a problem space?
Yeah, so I think we need to redesign information systems to take account of how the human brain filters information, and how, in light of what we're learning about the weaknesses of the mind's filtering system. So one of the things we know about the process of vetting ideas is that it's a team sport. So if you hang out with a bunch of people who are really good at it, you're likely to absorb a lot of good ideas, whether you do the right thing or not, whether you're particularly active in idea vetting or not, if your social circles are full of people who ask the right questions and who know which sources are reliable, then you're likely to develop a fairly accurate belief system.
Right.
But if you fall in with a group of people who are addled by conspiracy theories or who trust unreliable sources or who are manipulated by propagandists, your belief system is likely to degrade as well. So it's a team sport. We have to work together. And in science, there's a new book out by Jonathan Rauch, the syndicated columnist, called The Constitution of Knowledge, where he argues that, you mentioned him, I think.
That's right, yeah.
In our email. So he basically says one of the most important fruits of modernity is this highly collaborative approach to vetting knowledge. Science is an institution where many, many people check each other's work to make sure that the information is as reliable as possible. And when we reject science or disdain it, we're actually rejecting the foundation of modern society. Mm-hmm. So a big part of rebuilding our resistance to misinformation and disinformation and information warfare is learning how to test ideas properly so that we can become contributors to this massively distributed process of idea filtering. I mean, there's no reason why we should all rely on a handful of people in lab coats to do all our idea filtering for us. Mm-hmm. We need everybody on deck. We need all hands on deck for this problem, and we need everyone to up their game, because any one person who's too gullible can essentially become a super spreader right. of disinformation.
Yeah, Andy, no doubt, I agree with all that, especially that it's about a team sport. And so, what are you and your colleagues at CIRCE working on now that is going to continue to advance this field?
Yeah, so I think everybody who's awake today recognizes that epidemics of nonsense or bad ideas are a serious threat to civilization. I assume that's kind of built into the concept of cognitive security that's so central to the Cognitive Crucible podcast.
It is for sure. We believe that we are in a generationally defining moment here.
Absolutely.
Different. Every generation has its own challenge, and information and cognitive related processing is our generational challenge, I believe.
That's right. And so I think a historical analogy can help here. There was a time when diseases just ran rampant through Europe, and say the Black Death just killed off like a third of Europe's occupants. And in the centuries after that, we developed microscopes, we developed the germ theory of disease, and we came to understand how the immune system can be activated to protect us against smallpox and diphtheria and polio. And one of the most astonishing success stories in the sciences is the development of virology and immunology, because it saved literally hundreds of millions of lives. Now, I think the same thing is going to happen in the coming years as a new field called information epidemiology, and its corresponding science, the one I'm trying to develop, cognitive immunology, as they begin to learn and grow. So in the same way that we can protect our bodies against smallpox with a smallpox vaccine, turns out we can probably protect our minds against epidemics of divisive ideologies, or epidemics of conspiracy thinking, or outbreaks of propaganda. We can do that by learning how to strengthen the mind's immune system. So my colleagues and I at CIRCE are actually trying to map out a future where humanity as a whole has something like herd immunity to the most toxic forms of information, of disinformation and cognitive contagion. So imagine a future where divisive ideologies just don't run roughshod through populations and divide nations against themselves. What would it take to get there? My colleagues and I have assembled a group of some of the top thinkers and researchers in the field. We're actually seeking funding so that we can actually bring the best minds together, figure out how we can get from here to a world where, imagine if everybody on Earth had critical thinking skills that were 3 times as powerful as we have today. Mm-hmm. That could happen within the next decade or two if we develop the science of cognitive immunology and apply its findings, especially to the educating of young people.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to Dr. Andy Norman of Carnegie Mellon University. The book is Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind-Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think. We'll have links in the show notes. And Andy's center is the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative. Also a link in the show notes with links to the growing body of research related to cognitive immunology. And with that, Andy Norman, thank you so much for being on The Cognitive Crucible.
Been a pleasure, John. Thank you.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.